right into it. I think we'll start with introductions. Please, maybe Victor, if you don't mind starting, and then we'll move down the panel in this direction.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Jesse. Thanks for the invite. It's great to be here after Lugano. Hi, everybody. I'm Victor Solomon from Tokenization Expert. We're helping companies to issue tokens here in El Salvador. We help them to get certified. For every issuance, you need a certification. We write that certification for you. And we also help companies to get the digital asset service provider licenses here. Yeah.
Thank you, Jesse, and welcome everyone to El Salvador. I'm Cesar Cordova. I'm a director of the National Commission of Digital Assets, the authority who supervises, regulates, and authorizes the issuances, the tokenization, and provides regulation for the market. Very nice to meet you all, and welcome.
Hi, I'm Tamara, and I'm a legal advisor for BFX Securities. I'm just going to say we also have on the ground here our new head of compliance, Thomas Sura. I don't know, I saw him a few seconds ago. There he is. Hi, this is Thomas, and he heads up the AML compliance at BFX Securities as well.
So when we look at security tokens, I kind of look at it at three main pieces to the puzzle. I think the first is, investable assets that people actually want to contribute capital to. The second is the technology that facilitates the issuance of these tokens and allows people to trade them in secondary markets. And the third component is probably the most important, has been really probably the slowest to develop, and that's the regulatory structure. So to start us off, Tim, can you maybe do a high-level introduction to the legal approach and the framework that's been adopted here in El Salvador?
In terms of regulation of securities, there's a number of approaches that are adopted by regulators. The approach in El Salvador is particularly interesting because what's been done here is, in most regimes, most people in this room will be familiar with the difficulties that arise because of uncertainties as to whether a digital asset is a security and an asset is regulated elsewhere. But if it's a digital asset, it's regulated by CLAD. And that's a fundamental change of approach from most other regimes worldwide. And I think it's the sort of the core that's worth focusing on for the rest of this discussion.
So as Tim mentioned, Cesar, the approach for the regulatory framework was to specifically carve out digital assets from the security laws. What was the thinking behind that structure, the strategy behind that? And then, kind of touching on what Tim said, does that mean that the issuances from El Salvador aren't necessarily securities?
Exactly. There was a pretty expressed distinction made in the law, in the Article 3 of the issuances law here in El Salvador, that specifically says that the digital assets will not be considered a security. Why is that? Because we didn't want to create a confusion, as usually happens with what's the regulation applicable to digital assets, who is the regulator, and it makes it clear that it must be a different regulator, it must be different regulation, and makes it clear that the National Commission of Digital Assets is the only one certified and allowed to regulate, supervise those types of issuances. So as sometimes JC, the president of the commission, says, when you take a look at the car, it's different if it's a mechanical car or an electric car. When trouble arises, you don't go to the regular mechanic to take care of your electric car. So you need someone specialized that can take a look at the technology, knows what is on-chain investigations, what the platform must do to correctly function and serve the public better.
So, Tim, maybe the complication around that is that within El Salvador, these digital assets won't be considered securities. But for an investor coming in from another market, whether it's Hong Kong or someplace in Europe, globally, it's probably viewed as a security, right? So how is that approached, and what are the concerns there?
Yeah, so El Salvador can only legislate for what goes on domestically. So we've spoken about the distinction between products which are digital assets and therefore regulated by CLAD, and products which are not digital assets and are regulated elsewhere. Regulators anywhere else in the world will look at the same asset and say, we're going to apply our own analysis to that asset. And in most regimes, if it has the features of a security, a bond, or the features of a derivative, for example, they were regulated as a security or a derivative, and that's the approach taken. So what it means practically, a number of things. I think it's worth, particularly when talking about securities, is thinking about what the reason behind the legislation everywhere, and that includes El Salvador as well. You have a specialist regulator for digital assets, but in terms of what an investor is buying, they're buying a product, at least in the security space, slightly different with derivatives. They're buying a product which, at its core, has a significant asymmetry between the knowledge of the issuer or the company that's issuing the product and the purchaser. So in every regime, there's a need to have some way of bringing the investor, the purchaser of the product, up to the necessary level of knowledge that they need to be able to make an informed decision around what they're purchasing. And that hasn't changed in El Salvador. You've just got a regulator who understands some of the nuances or differences of the way the product is being wrapped up as a tokenized product. The core need to make investors understand the product exists. So in any of these jurisdictions, you have a number of approaches. You would have a sort of perhaps the most original approach was that you would have the exchange on which the product is being listed be the one that reviews the offering document. In El Salvador, it's a relevant information document. In most other jurisdictions, it might be called the prospectus. They would review the offering document and make sure that it gives the information to the investors, the sufficient and accurate and correct information to the investors that's needed. Another approach would be that you have the regulator take that onto itself and do that push back against the issuer to make sure that the investor is given the information that's needed. Here, a slight difference, which is particularly relevant to tokenized or digital assets, is that you have a certifier involved as well. And in the legislation, the certifier is the one who's responsible, not directly responsible to the investor, but actually responsible to the CNAD. And they produce a report that's given to the CNAD. And then the CNAD, if the report is favourable, would then approve the issuance. And I think that's going to be talked about a little bit later. But that's a distinction. And wrapped up in that role of the certifier is something more than an exchange who might review what the product is and what information is being given to investors, something more than perhaps a regulator doing that. It's also kicking the tires, if I could put it like that, around the actual product itself and making sure that from a technological perspective, which goes back to the analogy of the car, to make sure that from a technological perspective, it's appropriate for the investors. And that's a significant departure from most securities regimes.
Yeah, and what I like about the... And what I have to say to build on what Tim and Cesar just said, Salvador, you have a regulator which is new and it works kind of like a startup and moves faster. In other countries, you have the main capital markets regulator that has a department that works with digital assets, and that can make things a bit slower. But here you have a dedicated regulator that works only with digital assets and can make amendments to the law, to the regulation, knows what they're talking about. They're focusing only on these electric cars, and the communication with it's quite different than in other places. Yeah.
I wanted to dig into some of the practical details of how you actually do this and what the steps are. So, Victor, can you talk about what the steps are for an issuance? And I think one of the unique parts also of the El Salvador framework is that the regulator is required by the regulation to be very, very fast. So could you maybe mention some of those timelines as well and how that works?
Sure. So first of all, when you have the idea, let's say, I have a company, I want to tokenize it. You write the white paper. Here in El Salvador, it's called the relevant information document. Where you say, I want to issue 1,000 tokens. I want to sell them for $1 a piece. I want to list them maybe on that venue. Once you have that established, you go and potentially talk to a Bitfinex Securities or with the digital asset service provider that can help you with the issuance. Once you have that settled and that collaboration is kind of done, you go and talk to a certifier. We are a certifier, so basically you talk to a regulated company like ours, and then we do a small audit on your issuance. We have to make sure that you respect all the letters of the law. We have a checklist. Okay, you mentioned that in your relevant information document. Okay, you mentioned that. Oh, you have to improve this a bit more. So we make sure that the regulator can have an accelerated decision-making process. That means that in the law, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Cesar, the regulator needs to answer in 5 working days to any inquiry. So you have the relevant information document, you have your partnerships done for issuance and listing. Ideally, you come to us, you get the certified report, and then we submit this package of documents to the regulator. They review it, and then they say, you're missing this, you're missing that, or let's have a talk so we can understand better what's happening. If they don't have any questions and everything is clear, in 5 days you have your issuance accepted and you can move forward with the sales of the tokens. In some cases, maybe Cesar can build on that, the regulator might have some questions. Maybe you do an issuance which is not that usual. Maybe you want to tokenize something which is not that common in the market. What we've seen so far, we've seen a lot of real estate tokenization, shares tokenizations, debt tokenization, cash flow tokenization, even some kind of hash rate tokenization coming in El Salvador. So we've seen different types of issuances. If you want to create a new product which is super special, the regulator might have some other questions, but we as a certifier, we're here to help you in this journey. Yeah.
And maybe to build on what Jesse and Victor was saying, the certifier, the important thing is they are authorized and supervised by the commission. So they are an actor that they basically put their license in play when they say that an issuance can be made, can be put to the public, because if there is no viability, be it technological or financial, or there is a problem with the issuances, their neck is on the line and not the issuers. So that's a great responsibility, and it helps the commission to work. There is a public register for all the certifiers that it's online, so everyone can know who are the ones that have the license and that are currently approved by the commission to do business.
And Victor, I'm sure every issuer asks you this question: how long?
How long does it take to get this report?
Or until they can be certified, and before they can be certified, certification can be completed and approval from Senad. So how long until they could actually issue tokens from zero?
From our experience, a lot of people come to us and they say they're ready. But once we look at their documents, they still miss some stuff. So if you're really, really ready, you come to us. Maybe in a couple of weeks, you're going to have the certified report and you're going to be ready to be submitted to Senad, and then maybe another week. So in 2-3 weeks, if you're really ready. Our record time was 2 weeks in total. Certified report done, audit done, and then the regulator accepted the issuance. We have also some cases where it takes maybe 2 months, but it should be just a matter of weeks. Yeah.
2 months is kind of what I guide people, because outside of what Victor and Cesar outlined, BFX Securities, we also have a listing committee. We need to make sure that the project is commercially viable, that there's actually investors that will commit capital to the product. And then it takes some time and back and forth with that. So I usually say 2 months from start to finish to make sure everything is in place, and then we can go to market with it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair estimate, 2 months. Maybe you need to adjust a bit your relevant information document. You need to collect some documents, some passport copies and different things from the UBOs. You need to discuss maybe with some anchor investors informally to see if they are willing to invest. And if you go with these anchor investors to the regulator, you might be fast-tracked for issuance, especially if the investors are institutional. So, so far we helped with more or less 8 issuances. We have a pipeline of 10 to 20 more issuances that are coming. We see a lot of securities that are being tokenized. So already traded securities on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ are going to be tokenized in El Salvador. And we have also some original types of issuances. A lot of things are coming.
That's great. maybe returning to the regulatory framework a little bit, Tim and Caesar, how would you match up the El Salvador framework versus other regulatory regimes? So Bitfinex Securities is registered in 2 jurisdictions. We're in El Salvador, of course. And then we're also in the AIFC, which is a financial center like Dubai in Astana, Kazakhstan. So maybe using that as a benchmark, Tim, I think it's quite a conventional kind of structure in the AIFC. How would you match up El Salvador structure versus the AIFC? And then Caesar, maybe you can add anything else on top of that.
I think the role of the regulator we've covered. One of the similarities I just dwell on, which applies and is always something for anyone who's issuing securities to keep in mind, is that it comes back to the kind of the core concept around what a security is, whether it's a security that you call a security or whether it's a digital asset that's a security. If you're going to be marketing it in any jurisdiction, you need to make sure that you're not cutting across the national or domestic marketing restrictions. So you can say in El Salvador, there may not be particularly strict restrictions in terms of how you market a security, but the moment you because of how websites work, etc. The moment you make that available, or your marketing has an effect in another jurisdiction, you need to make sure that is compliant with the law of the person who's seeing the marketing. So I'm just mentioning that because that's a kind of a common denominator that applies across both regimes. Of course, the approach of the regulator is different. And the role of the certifier is a fundamental difference between El Salvador and most regimes. But at its core, I think you have a specialist regulator who focuses entirely on digital assets. What I think you're going to see start developing here is a regulator who starts to get much more confident around what the actual products are. As they see different products come through, they'll get much more competent around being able to push back on certain things, starting to give guidance to market about what they want to see in terms of disclosures, etc. And I think that is a difference from a regulator who is probably pulled in all different directions and is also trying to address the needs of what you might call a kind of vested or legacy financial services sector, where you've got a very dynamic new industry coming through, and the regulator can be prepared to sort of service that industry, if that's the right word, rather than a regulator who's trying to make sure that they bring everyone along at a similar pace. So I think that's a distinction that's worth focusing on as well.
Yeah, and I won't name names, but after the GAFILAT the evaluation, we had some discussion with the countries that were present, and there were very basic questions about the technology, how it works. So we saw the opportunity to do an international outreach program so we can establish a standard, and it helps all the countries that form part of the GAFILAT region to understand the subject, because the main problem of the authorities or the government's institutions is that they don't know what the hell is this blockchain, at least Bitcoin. Very basic questions, 101, that they have to at least have some knowledge to approach the industry and to approve this type of sophisticated and very innovative products.
I was just going to add one more thing. Just along those lines, around the sort of sophistication of the products, what you'll see in many jurisdictions, which you don't have in El Salvador, is a differentiation in the legislation in terms of who the product can be sold to. So you will often have a kind of professional investor regime or a sophisticated or an accredited investor regime in many jurisdictions. In El Salvador, they don't have that, and as a result of that, there's no minimum ticket size as well. So you've got, in many ways, a much more democratic regime. I think that brings with it, obviously, sort of certain additional risks for the regulator in terms of approvals, because it's going to be the products are going to be made available to a much less sophisticated audience than they would if they imposed some restrictions in terms of who can purchase. It probably imposes additional obligations on the issuer as well, because they have to think about who is going to be reading this relevant information document, Is it appropriately worded for an investor base that isn't sophisticated? And probably for the exchange as well, it brings in sort of additional considerations in terms of how it's going to be made available as well. So it is a difference. And you may say, well, you can address those things by making sure that the product is appropriately described, and you can address those things by making sure that nobody's going to be able to purchase using sort of leverage to purchase more than they can afford, etc. But fundamentally, those differences are worth again addressing and sort of thinking about in El Salvador.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to highlight. We have a tokenized T-bill product on the platform, for example, that has a $1 minimum. People can invest for $1, and I think that's innovative and important because part of the tokenization value proposition from the start was to bring liquidity to illiquid assets. And to be honest, that's something on the security side we've struggled with, as most of our issuances have been accredited only and have various friction points along that. And you end up getting an order book with a bid and an ask that you can drive a bus through, right? There's just not much trading going on. So we're quite excited in El Salvador, I think, to get more investors of different backgrounds, with different time horizons, different investment strategies, and to create that liquidity that I think will ultimately be one of the biggest, most valuable parts of what we're trying to do with security tokenization. Cesar, I wanted to ask you that, time goes by so quickly. It seems like not that long ago we were trying to work out the regulatory framework. I'm trying to think, has Senad been on operation for more? Has it just been a year, right? It was November of
2023, this specific board of directors. So it's a year and some months.
Yeah, that's crazy. So can you, what have you guys focused on in that time? There's just a ton of work because you came with a brand new regulatory framework. You had to hire people from scratch. You had to, go through all the documentation. Then you had applicants from around the world. What have you guys been working on, and what's your focus been over the last 12 months?
It's a great question, a whole story that could be a book, because you have to have a startup mentality to do a new institution, because the law is in place at the beginning of 2023, and there's already a backlog because there's a lot of institutions that filed their request to be part of the ecosystem. So when this board of directors with Juan Carlos Reyes, Miguel Serafin, and myself takes place, there's a lot of emails unanswered, a lot of files that haven't been looked at, and we have to work on that and also do the work to outreach to the companies, to do what they are doing, to do the international outreach. And on top of that, there was in January the evaluation from Gafilat. So it has been a lot of work. There's that, and a lot's being accomplished, I think, in 1 year.
Yeah.
So that's why the startup mentality helps to keep running at the same pace that the industry is going, because you can't stop or trying to be with the same government mentality. And I think it's all across the institutions that there's this new way to work, new ways to do things faster and quicker, and to promote this type of innovation. So I think one of the main goals that have been reached is to so countries get to know CNAD, what's the framework, trying to establish a standard that is available to the countries, not just the region, but worldwide. We were recognized that the regulation, as it is right now, is the number 2 most positive regulation for crypto in the world, just behind Switzerland. So we are just in the moment and the place, and we have the tools to not just be pioneers, but to make things happen.
That makes me think. Do you see yourself as a crypto regulator, or do you see yourself as a kind of STO RWA regulator? Do you make like a distinction there?
It's a mixed bag, because what we see is and what we are trying to focus on is real world assets.
Yeah.
That they have a backing in place for tokenizations. We don't trying to get meme coins or other type of assets that we don't want that in the country.
We won't see a Bukele coin?
Yeah. No, we're trying to look for real asset backing for tokenization that are happening in El Salvador. So that's the main focus we're looking for.
To both of you, Victor and Cesar. Victor, you mentioned that people often come to you thinking they have all their documents in place and that they're ready to go, and I can very much sympathize with that. That happens to us as well. What can people do from your perspective, helping people with the documentation? What can they do to make sure that they can move through the process as quickly as possible? And then maybe, Cesar, the same to you. Maybe you can add on that. What do you see the mistakes where people kind of fall down and where they need to provide more information in detail?
Sure. I mean, if you have an idea, if you want to tokenize something, talk to me. I can send you a template. You can start by using that. It's based on our work. You can use it. You can, and then you have a good start. Another good resource is to go on the CNAD website at the bottom for I think it's called the regulatory framework or something like that, and required documents. Then you have a few PDFs that say you need to have this, that included in the relevant information document. So print that out, take a pen and say, oh, I have this in, okay. It's a boring job, but you have to do it, And then you need to have all your corporate documents in order. You need to have the certificate of incorporation. You have to have, if you're issuing from a company which is abroad, that's also important. If you can be based in Germany, Switzerland, Singapore, or in other jurisdictions, you can issue a token in El Salvador without establishing a legal entity.
Just to interrupt you, I think that's worth highlighting, is that you do not need to domicile a country in El Salvador.
Correct.
You can be domiciled overseas and issue via El Salvador.
Correct. So even if you issue from a foreign company, you need to have your corporate documents in order, because we're going to do a KYC on you. The regulator will do a KYC on you. So we have to know who are the UBOs, so where do the funds come from. And we need to make sure that you have everything in order also from a technical perspective. Either you have a partner like BFX Securities, or you have another setup, maybe it's proprietary to you. You need to have that in place, and you need to show to the regulator that you're able to manage all the operations and all the technical stuff.
And the most common, what we see in the filings, not mistake, but what we see on the documents is that someone has not done their homework. So the first advice I will give you as regulator is do your research. Don't wait for other partners or stakeholders to tell you what's the regulation like in El Salvador. We have a website that's both in English and Spanish, and the regulation is both in English and Spanish, so you can look for yourself as trust. Don't verify, don't trust in the regulation. So do your homework. Try to see how is the filing done. What are the requirements? Also, the AML regulation is very specific here in El Salvador, and it's very. My advice is you take a look at it, study it, and then find partners that are trusted partners here in El Salvador. In the public register, we have some of the companies that are already working and are authorized and supervised in El Salvador, and you can go from there and then go to the lawyers specifically to go through the whole filing process.
I would also strongly recommend to bring the DASP, the Digital Asset Service Provider, BFX Securities, into the process as early as possible, because there's nothing more frustrating, I think, for an issuer to go through all these hoops and hurdles and then find out from us that we need to restructure all your documentation because of our specific, requirements. One of the things I think is worth mentioning is on the technology side is, El Salvador is Bitcoin country. So we have a strong preference to do things on top of Bitcoin. The Liquid network is where we've done most of our issuances. So that's one thing that can be a hurdle for people, is if they've got their mind to do an issuance on a specific technology and it's something that hasn't been vetted or integrated by us, that's a stumbling block that we often find people kind of tripping up on.
Maybe just to build on that, nobody at the table likes other chains than Bitcoin, but there are other...
That's why you're here, Victor.
But in El Salvador, we've seen people issuing tokens mainly on the Liquid network. There are also some EVM compatible issuances. There are some other chains. Even some people try Solana. Some people like it, some people don't like it, but they issue on, and it's accepted. But if you issue it on an EVM chain, you need to make sure that you have all the compliance and tools in place. So it's good to use a smart contract that it's already audited and battle tested, and it has all the compliance checks in place and gives you a lot of control over the tokens to make the token as safe as it would be on the Liquid network, for example.
So you're saying the Liquid network is the premier kind of standard level for security tokenization issues?
I'm not saying that, JC. I mean, the market is saying that, but
that's very good, Victor. We'll have you back next year as well. Maybe to kind of the last question for everybody is, what types of assets do you see, like what verticals in terms of like fixed income, real estate, equity, bonds? Where do you see the majority of the interest at the moment? Where are kind of the hot spots? And then who are the issuers? Are they just like very broadly? Are they funds? Are they maybe institutionals? And where are they domiciled? Is it regional or is it international? Maybe if you could provide some color on that, both Victor and Cesar.
Yeah, sure. So I would split them into domestic issuers and foreign issuers. When we have domestic issuers, because there's a big tax incentive component, people try to tokenize what's already doable in the traditional space. They want to tokenize that in order to have some tax benefits. So from the local issuers, we see a lot of real estate. We've seen a lot of cash flow tokenization. We've seen a lot of shares, debt tokenization. Also, we've seen commodities tokenization. From the foreign players, we've seen mainly shares and debt. There's some real estate as well, and there's some other special projects, as I said, maybe hash rate or some kind of hash rate tokenization. We've seen various types of tokenization of listed securities on a traditional stock exchange. So people are tokenizing U.S. treasuries. They're tokenizing ETFs.
Yeah.
So we've seen a lot of these issuances, and I think in the next 3-4 months we're going to see maybe 20-30 of them.
Yeah, and in the broader spectrum of what Victor was mentioning, I think the one that reaches the commission the most right now, it's in plain view for everybody. There is a huge construction boom here in El Salvador, so there's a lot of infrastructure and real estate that's being tokenized, as well as more sophisticated financial products that are based on fixed income or equity. So more and more, we're seeing more innovation in those type of products, in the structuring of so.
I think those two verticals are especially interesting because we were talking at breakfast, if you want to invest, El Salvador is a growth story, right? And everybody wants to get exposure to that growth. But how do you get exposure through conventional means? I think it's really, really difficult. So if we can tokenize real estate and, projects that are benefiting from the boom here in El Salvador, I think that's a really, really good way for people internationally to not only get exposure, but kind of support what's happening here as well. And, my background is in capital markets as well, doing things like depository receipts. And I've always thought that tokenized public equity is a very, very exciting vertical because you can have tokenized forms that are trading 24/7, 365. And I think there's going to be natural kind of flow of funds between the conventional and the tokenized issuances. So that's really exciting.
Yeah, and just to build on what Jesse just said, so for people that have capital constraints in their country, so for example, for people in Argentina or in different places, this is the tokenization of real-world assets in that perspective. So you have a New York Stock Exchange type of stock tokenized. It's fantastic because with USDT or with USDC, you can buy directly this asset. And there are people that try to do that also in a geofence, decentralized finance type of manner. So we have cases like that. which is quite innovative. And what I think it's going to happen on the real estate side, and I think it's going to be super exciting also for me personally, if there's going to be a lot of real estate being tokenized, it would be cool to have indexes. So you will have the Surf City index, where you're going to have a basket of 50 properties, and then you just invest in that basket. You will have the San Salvador real estate index fund, which is tokenized here. That's going to be super fantastic and super easy for retail investors and people from abroad that want to participate in this boom to have some exposure to it.
That's great. Well, we kind of got to wrap it up here. We could probably go on for another couple of hours, but we need to wrap it up to try and keep on schedule. But I do want to open it up quickly for questions. Maybe if we can just squeak out 5 minutes for questions quickly, and then we'll have a break for coffee and drinks. Hi. Good. Hi.
Can you hear me, guys? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So the first question is directed to the certifier, and following up on the opinion of the National Commission regarding the application of SAFTs, of Simple Agreement for Future Tokens, in the public offering of digital assets. Following the logic that Jesse was mentioning on securing some type of investment before the listing takes place in order to do successful emissions. Do you guys have any history applying SAFTs here? Is it viable?
Usually you do SAFTs for utility tokens. You mean to do a SAFT for a utility token or whatever kind of token?
For authorized investment, just in order to carry out...
You mean kind of like underwriting? Do you mean underwriting to make sure that you have investors to participate in the token issuance?
Yeah, like the equivalent agreement for future equity.
Yeah. From my experience, we didn't work with any SAFTs or safe type of contract so far. What I've seen, the market is happening that I have an issuer that already has commitments, soft commitments, and they do some kind of informal handshake with the anchor investor. They do all the regulatory procedure, and with the documents prepared, they go to the investor, and then they kind of sign the agreement and move forward with it, from my perspective.
First of all, we haven't gotten a project like that yet. You can file it and see what happens. There's also the difference between private issuances and the public issuance. So you have already a tool to get already sophisticated investors that are interested into investing in that product, if that applies.
And I just add, the way that would get wrapped up into the regime we've been talking about would be that any investor who comes in for the secondary market trading would need to have any information about the vesting, etc., that was put out in the SAFT, put into the relevant information documents, so they could be aware of that.
Anyone else? I think we have time for probably one more. Let's do two more.
I just wanted to clarify one specific thing. So where is the delineation between securities and digital assets? Like, is there a Howey test that applies? Or it's simply the fact that if you tokenize anything, that as long as it meets the requirements of the certifier and the authority, that it's approved?
Yeah, so in El Salvador, if it's a digital asset, even if it looks and smells and is a security anywhere else in the world, it's outside of the securities regime. It's under the CNAS regime. But to the extent that product would be made available elsewhere, outside of El Salvador, you have to look to the regime of the purchaser to make sure that you're not cutting across any domestic requirements.
Exactly. As Tim says, it's clear in the law, Article 3, and there's no need to do a common law test because it's explained there how digital assets, it's not.
Wow.
So practically for an issuer and for the DAS, us, we treat it as a security. So we look at it as a security to take a kind of conservative approach.
Everything is in one basket. In Switzerland or in Europe, you have payment tokens, utility tokens, asset-backed tokens, or hybrid tokens. Here, everything is in one basket.
Okay, final question.
Hello. Is to be with Phoenix more on the side of if you get these new issuances coming in, And you want to build a market for that, right? So if you could speak to how Bitfinex or who's going to go about creating this sort of network effect around these new types of securities being emitted, because we don't want to emit all these new securities to nobody, right? Who's the buyer?
So if you're talking about secondary markets, I think my view on this is probably slightly different than some people's view. I think it depends really on the size of the asset. So if you're doing, a low double-digit issuance, say you're doing 5 million or a $10 million issuance, I think that naturally that order book should be kind of skinny. I don't think it's going to be a very active order book, and I don't think it's necessary for people to make markets and have very active trading in a small issuance. Every issuance we do, there is an order book, and as I mentioned, I said, sometimes the bid and the ask is quite wide for various reasons. And our idea is to kind of provide people the opportunity of liquidity, but I don't think every issuance, especially the smaller ones, are going to have very liquid secondary markets, and I think we're fairly fine with that. As to who are the investors, it's anybody who can open an account on Bitfinex and Bitfinex Securities. So we've got a list of jurisdictional and restrictions on that and types of investors that can participate. And I think that probably answers your question.